Star Wars film series, which can be used to attack military and civilian satellites and targets anywhere on Earth. Space weapons are seen as first-strike weapons rather than defensive arms because they are vulnerable to countermeasures. Their deployment, therefore, could be seen as a sign of U.S. intent to use force in international affairs. China and others may develop low-cost space weapons in reaction, so that U.S. policy could trigger an arms race in space. Furthermore, to protect against the potential loss of its deterrent capability, China could also resort to building up its nuclear forces, which could in turn encourage India and then Pakistan to follow suit. Russia has already threatened to respond to any country's deployment of space weapons, an act that could undermine the already fragile nuclear non-proliferation regime. Meanwhile, the Pentagon is pondering a disturbing study by its leading academic consultant on the Chinese military, who has investigated Chinese-language military texts and interviewed their authors, drawing a conclusion that has rattled many in Washington. China sees the U.S. as a military rival. We must therefore abandon the idea that China is an inherently gentle country, and recognize that the paranoid and devious Chinese may be quietly treading the path of evil. Former NATO planner Michael Maguire reminds us that in 1986, recognizing the dreadful logic of nuclear weapons, Mikhail Gorbachev called for their total elimination, a proposal that foundered on Reagan's militarization of space programs, Star Wars. Western doctrine, he writes, was explicitly premised on the credible threat of first use of nuclear weapons, and that continues to be policy today. Russia had kept to the same doctrine until 1994, when it reversed its stand, adopting a no-first-use policy. But Russia reverted to NATO doctrine and abandoned its call for abolition of nuclear weapons in response to Clinton's expansion of NATO, in violation of Washington's categorical assurance to Gorbachev that if he would agree to a reunited Germany, remaining in NATO, the alliance would not expand eastwards to absorb former members of the Warsaw Pact. In the light of earlier history, not to speak of strategic truisms, Clinton's violation of firm pledges posed a serious security threat to Russia and is the antithesis of the exclusion principle underlying the concept of nuclear weapons-free zones, NWFZ. Clinton's violation of the assurances explains why NATO resisted formalizing the de facto NWFZ encompassing Central Europe from the Arctic to the Black Sea. Maguire goes on to point out that such formalization was proposed by Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia in the mid-1990s, but would have interfered with plans to extend NATO. Reverse reasoning explains why Washington supports the formation of an NWFZ in Central Asia. Should these former Soviet republics decide to join Russia in a military alliance, an NWFZ would deny Moscow the option of deploying nuclear weapons on their territory. Apocalypse soon. The probability of apocalypse soon cannot be realistically estimated, but it is surely too high for any sane person to contemplate with equanimity. While speculation is pointless, reaction to the stark and dreadful and inescapable choice Einstein and Russell described definitely is not. On the contrary, reaction is urgent, particularly in the United States, because of Washington's primary role in accelerating the race to destruction by extending its historically unique military dominance. The chances of an accidental, mistaken, or unauthorized nuclear attack might be increasing, warns former Senator Sam Nunn, who has played a leading role in efforts to reduce the threat of nuclear war. We are running an unnecessary risk of an Armageddon of our own making, Nunn observes, as a result of policy choices that leave America's survival dependent on the accuracy of Russia's warning systems and its command and control. None is referring to the sharp expansion of U.S. military programs, which tilt the strategic balance in ways that make Russia more likely to launch upon warning of an attack without waiting to see if the warning is accurate. The threat is enhanced by the fact that the Russian early warning system is in serious disrepair and more likely to give a false warning of incoming missiles. U.S. reliance on the high-alert, hair-trigger nuclear posture allows missiles to be launched within minutes, forcing our leaders to decide almost instantly whether to launch nuclear weapons once they have warning of an attack, robbing them of the time they may need to gather data, exchange information, gain perspective, discover an error, and avoid a catastrophic mistake. The risk extends beyond Russia, and also China, if it pursues the same course. Strategic analyst Bruce Blair observes that the early warning and control problems plaguing Pakistan, India, and other nuclear proliferators are even more acute. Another serious concern, discussed in technical literature well before 9/11, is that nuclear weapons may sooner or later fall into the hands of terrorist groups, who might use these and other weapons of mass destruction with lethal effect. Those prospects are being advanced by Bush administration planners, who do not consider terrorism a high priority, as they regularly demonstrate. Their aggressive militarism has not only led Russia to expand significantly its offensive capacities, including more lethal nuclear weapons and delivery systems, but is also inducing the Russian military to transfer nuclear weapons constantly across Russia's vast territory to counter mounting U.S. threats. Washington planners are surely aware that Chechen rebels, who had already stolen radioactive materials from nuclear waste plants and power stations, have been casing the railway system and special trains designed for shipping nuclear weapons across Russia. Blair warns that this perpetual motion within Russia creates a serious vulnerability, because transportation is the Achilles heel of nuclear weapons security, ranking in danger right alongside maintaining strategic nuclear forces on hair-trigger alert. He estimates that every day, many hundreds of Russian nuclear weapons are moving around the countryside. Theft of one nuclear bomb could spell eventual disaster for an American city, but this is not the worst-case scenario stemming from this nuclear gamesmanship. More ominously, the seizure of a ready-to-fire strategic long-range nuclear missile or a group of missiles capable of delivering bombs to targets thousands of miles away could be apocalyptic for entire nations. Another major threat is that terrorist hackers might break into military communication networks and transmit launch orders for missiles armed with hundreds of nuclear warheads. No fantasy, as the Pentagon learned a few years ago when serious defects were discovered in its safeguards, requiring new instructions for Trident submarine launch crews. Systems in other countries are much less reliable. All of this constitutes an accident waiting to happen, Blair writes, an accident that could be apocalyptic. The dangers of nuclear warfare are consciously being escalated by the threat and use of violence, which, as long predicted, is also stimulating jihadi terrorism. Such terrorism traces back to Reagan administration programs to organize, arm, and train radical Islamists, not for defense of Afghanistan, as proclaimed, but for the usual and ugly reasons of state, with grim consequences for the tormented people of Afghanistan. The Reagan administration also cheerfully tolerated Pakistan's slide toward radical Islamist extremism under the rule of Muhammad Zia al-Haq, one of the many brutal dictators supported by the current incumbents in Washington and their mentors. Reagan and associates also looked away politely while their Pakistani ally was developing nuclear weapons, annually endorsing the pretense that Pakistan was not doing so. They and the Clinton administration paid little attention while Pakistan's leading proliferator now tapped on the wrist was carrying out the world's most extraordinary nuclear smuggling enterprise, Abdul Qadir Khan, who did